Yes. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? So I don't have to use the microphone? Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you about TPP today. The TPP is an exciting topic. Lots of countries, very big agreement, generates a lot of politics, and a lot of people find it very interesting. So I hope to give you some insight today into the US perspective on TPP and the status of the current negotiation. But more important, I think it's very important to review how Japanese companies can take advantage of this agreement. There are lots of opportunities that hopefully will be available, and it's important to know how to take advantage of them, what the risks are with TPP, and from a US perspective, how US Customs enforces the TPP to make sure that goods that come into the United States are actually properly being declared for zero duty under an FTA. So I'm going to cover a lot of things, and I don't have a lot of time, so hopefully we'll be able to get through everything. There we go. So there are many large free trade agreements. There's the ASEAN FTA, there's the China-ASEAN FTA. There are many regional agreements. What makes this agreement different is that the US is involved. And that's because the US insists that FTAs be comprehensive. And in the United States, that is a very specific term. When the US says it wants a comprehensive agreement, that means the agreement must cover everything. It has to cover all goods, all sectors, whether they're sensitive or not. It has to cover beyond goods. It has to cover services. It has to cover investment. It has to cover regulatory matters. So when the US wants to pursue an FTA, it insists that its partners are very comprehensive. Most other FTAs in the world tend to carve out many things. So you might have an FTA with another country, but you might carve out agriculture. Well, the US doesn't see it that way. The US wants everything included in the agreement. And so the key features of all US FTAs are the total elimination of tariff and non-tariff barriers on the trade in goods and services, direct investment protections, labor rights that enhance working conditions, commitment on environmental protection. That's relatively new over the last 10 or 15 years. Rules to protect digital products, e-commerce, and telecommunications from discrimination. Protection of intellectual property. And commitments to adopt common approaches to regulatory matters. Now, you'll look at many of these, and I think the Japanese government would agree that many of these should be key features of any free trade agreement. The Japanese government and Japanese companies invest a lot overseas. Investment protections are very important. Rules to protect digital products, again, very important to the Japanese economy. Yet there are issues, as we'll see, that the US and Japan have come to disagree over that will be the subject of many a long night of negotiation. So because Japan was late to TPP, every TPP country had to approve Japan joining the negotiation. And that gave every country the opportunity to impose conditions on Japan's entry. The US, of course, set several conditions, and I've identified them here. And it gives you a sense for what the US really cares about in the negotiation. As part of Japan's invitation, Japan had to agree to let US tariffs on any future TPP on auto imports phase out over the longest period possible. So the longest period they could negotiate would apply to US auto imports from Japan. Japan agreed to increase imports of US-made vehicles under the preferential handling procedures from 2,000 to 5,000 per vehicle type. What I think is the most important item is number 3. There are negotiations between the US and Japan to establish what's called a special safeguard mechanism, which would allow the reimposition of US duties on Japanese product if Japan fails its commitments on auto trade. So you can see auto trade, auto trade, auto trade. It's cars, it's auto parts. Very important to the US government. They're also agreed to engage in negotiations during TPP to address non-tariff barriers related to auto trade, insurance, government procurement, competition policy, express delivery policy, and then sanitary and phytosanitary measures. Those are measures that affect animal and human health. But if you were to rank the conditions, the third one is definitely the most important to the United States. So what I've done here is listed by industry, really identifying the top 3 high-profile areas. U.S. autos and auto parts are, again, the number 1. Market access for U.S. beef. I'm sure that you're all familiar with the disputes the U.S. have had over beef with Japan. The December 2003 imposition ban on imported U.S. beef caused a lot of tension between Japan and the United States. There's been a partial lift of that ban, but the U.S. wants more. The U.S. wants a full elimination of that ban. And then perhaps less known, certainly less known to American policymakers, but still very important for the U.S. Negotiation team, is insurance and express delivery. I think the U.S. industry, Federal Express, UPS, those companies, feel that they struggle to enter this market. U.S. insurance companies feel they struggle to enter this market. There's concern over regulatory treatment that gives subsidies to Japan Post and its subsidiaries, as well as favorable regulatory treatment. So this is the view that the U.S. negotiators come in when they're negotiating with Japan. These are probably the 3 areas of all the areas to be discussed, the ones of highest priority. So I thought it would be useful to give you a sense of the US view on Japan's objectives. So what does the US think Japan wants out of TPP? So when the US's view is that Japan wants to join TPP as a desire to promote Japanese growth and prevent the relocation of Japanese companies overseas. That objective is very similar to the US objective. The US doesn't want its companies relocating overseas either. Avoid being left behind in negotiating free trade agreements. Also very similar to the US. We've seen there are many countries that have many more FTAs than the United States, in part because the US is such a difficult negotiator when it comes to a comprehensive agreement. So in many respects, the US has been left behind in many FTAs because it takes so long to negotiate. A desire to shape the rules of economic activity in the Asia-Pacific region. The US also wants, I think the US would like Japan to take that role, and I think the US also wants to play a more significant role in the Asia-Pacific region. So a lot of these objectives, if they're Japan's objectives, they're also American objectives. The US view is that Japan thinks, at least the current government thinks entering TPP will promote economic reform inside Japan. Perhaps you can tell me whether that's true or not. And also, the idea is that TPP could tie tie Japan to other Asian countries as a counterbalance to China. And again, I think the US would love for that to happen. So I think from the US perspective, Japan joining TPP is very important. I think the US wants Japan to play this role. And so it's why I think ultimately there will be an agreement. Because I think at the end of the day, the US wants Japan in TPP, and I think Japan wants to be in TPP. We'll just have to overcome a few of the issues that we've already talked about, and we'll talk about in a minute.
Excuse me, can I make interruption?
Sure, of course.
I have some Japanese explanation.
Okay, sure.
で今のまでのところで、実はTPP の概要についてお触れいただいたわけですが、もう今のお話を自分は分かるように、実は TPP の交渉分野は非常に広くございます。21分野、交渉チームは26チームございます。なぜかと申しますと、物品の関税問題だけで3グループに分かれたりしておりまして、この21分野といいますのはどれだけ広いかと申しますと、WTO の交渉分野よりもはるかに広い、日本の EPA ではとても対応しきれないような分野も含まれたりしております。これほど広い分野を TPP としては取り組んでいるということをご協力いただきました。実はこの後、具体的に何がどう動いているのかということをご説明いただきます。
So what's the current status of the negotiations? Well, there's going to be, this week in fact, in the United States, a chief negotiators meeting, which of all chief negotiators from all the TPP countries, which will lead to a ministerial level meeting to be held in late May. The major negotiating items left are intellectual property protections, which I think the US and Japan are probably on the same side. And then market access to sensitive areas like autos, rice, perhaps where Japan and the US are not on the same sides. And indeed, the view is that these issues won't get resolved in the whole agreement until Japan and the US resolve their own issues. It's reported that Japanese officials would like to reach a bilateral deal with the US when Prime Minister Abe meets with President Obama in a week and a half. So we'll see. There's a lot of work to do to get there. In order to really understand the nature of this negotiation, you have to understand a little bit about domestic American politics, which I hope not to bore you with too much. But in most countries, when a leader negotiates an agreement, the other parties can count on that leader to sign the agreement and to implement an agreement. Usually if a minister, or if in a parliamentary system, you have, if the prime minister negotiates something, he'll get it through the parliament. In the US, it does not work that way, right? In the US, we have a president and we have a Congress, and they disagree all the time. And under normal rules, international agreements must be submitted to the Congress for ratification. And Congress normally has the authority to amend those agreements. Everyone realizes that because Congress has this authority, it weakens the president's ability to negotiate. No one wants to negotiate with someone who can't stand behind an agreement. So in the US, we've come up with a solution to this, and it's called Trade Promotion Authority. We call it TPA. We also call it Fast Track Authority. You may have heard of it. It is legislation that gives the president the right to negotiate the treaty. And it limits Congress's authority to vote either yes or no, but they can't change it. It's a yes or no vote. This authority expired in 2007. And so and Japan and other TPP countries have expressed concern that it has not yet been authorized by the Congress. TPA is controversial in the United States, and it splits the normal coalitions. So the president's a Democrat, but most of the support for TPA in the Congress is Republican, with a few Democrats. Most Democrats are less favorable to free trade, and they want very strong labor and environmental provisions. But there are also some Republicans who don't like free trade because they're protectionist, and they don't like President Obama. So what's happened since I drafted this last week, what happened last week on Thursday is a Senate committee introduced TPA, introduced a bill. We don't yet know when it will be voted on, and it is still unclear whether the votes exist to pass it. But I believe most in the United States believe it will pass eventually, and it'll also lead to TPP. So, but TPP can't happen until this happens. Because Japan, no Japanese government is going to give their best deal to the US government until they know that it can't be changed by the Congress. That's the bottom line. So that's the current status of the negotiation. All very interesting, but not very practical. So why does TPP benefit Japanese companies? Japanese companies have exported in 2013, exported $139 billion in goods to the United States. And in 2012, $27 billion in services, insurance, banking, and the like. Now, the US services sector is largely open for competition. There aren't many hurdles to overcome. You're not going to get much out of that negotiation. Probably the biggest potential savings, at least in the US market, is on the goods side. And a useful example of the benefit is the US-Korea FTA, because that's a new FTA. It was very difficult, but it's finally implemented. So under the US-Korea FTA, 80% of tariffs on consumer and industrial products were eliminated the day it was implemented. Another 15% became duty-free on January 1, will become duty-free in January. And all remaining duties will be phased out by 2026. So rice, all the tough ones. It's the same issues, rice, agriculture, autos, they'll all be gone. It'll take another 11 years, but in 11 years they'll be gone. So that offers a lot of opportunity to save money. But there are always challenges to taking advantage of a free trade agreement. In the United States, FTA compliance is not that easy, and we'll talk a little more about that at the end of the presentation. Because it's not so easy, many US importers limit the number of suppliers they have that sell them duty-free product under a free trade agreement. Because proving the preference, proving the benefit can be burdensome to the US importer. And so importers like big consumer products companies like Target you may have heard of. I don't know if Target exists in Japan. But Target, Best Buy, the very large consumer product importers, they only source from a few companies because it's so burdensome. And importers take all the risk because it's up to the producer to prove that the product qualifies for the duty preference. And many global supply chains are also complex. And I'll give you an example from the Korea FTA, where I had a client, an global auto parts manufacturer, and they produced parts in Korea that they wanted to finish in Mexico for sale into the United States. Well, the product coming out of Mexico did not qualify for NAFTA, for the free trade agreement the US has with Mexico, because there was not enough Mexican content, because most of it was Korean. But it also didn't qualify for the Korea-US FTA, because under the Korea-US FTA, the product has to come directly from Korea to the United States. It's the principle of direct shipment. So here you have a Korean product being finished in Mexico. Both countries have FTAs with the United States, but my client had to pay duty and decided not to change their global supply chain because it just wasn't worth it. That 4% duty was not worth altering the way they do business. Now, if the duty were 10%, maybe it would. It depends. And those are the same kinds of issues your companies will probably have to deal with as well. So, this is the part of the presentation that's most like school. I wanted to just review exactly how do these free trade agreements provide preferences. Now, many of you may understand this already, which I apologize. But I think it's useful to explain how preferences are given to products. And there are really three ways. There are three rules. And what I've assumed is that the rules in TPP will be very similar to US-Korea, as they will be. So the three ways are: the good is either wholly obtained or produced in Japan, and I will explain what that means. Second, the good is produced entirely in Japan, only from raw materials from Japan or the US. Then it's considered part of, qualifies for duty-free status. I ask you how many products are produced in Japan of only Japanese or US raw materials. Very unlikely scenario. The third option is the good is produced in Japan, but there are raw materials from other countries. Those products can still qualify for a duty preference, but they have to undergo what's either called a tariff shift or a regional value content satisfaction. So I'm just going to talk through these reasonably quickly because I do not want you to get too bored. So the rule of origin 1, wholly obtained or produced, it typically applies to goods that are grown, farmed, or mined. Rice, if you grow rice in Japan, it's Japanese rice. No question about that. If you milk a Japanese cow in Japan, it's Japanese milk. Beef, mined products, silicon, ferromanganese. If you mine it in Japan, it's Japanese origin. So in the agricultural sector, this is very important. But it doesn't really apply to other products. The second rule is if the product is entirely produced in Japan with raw materials from Japan or the US. And I've come up with a very sophisticated product. It's called a horn. And that horn has two raw materials. It has brass and rubber, right? This part, that's just rubber, and that's just brass. And if the horn producer, the Japanese producer of this horn, buys brass and rubber manufactured in Japan, or the US, then the horn is Japanese origin. Very simple, right? But it becomes less simple when the brass or the rubber isn't from Japan anymore, or the United States. When that happens, you have to go through a more sophisticated analysis. First, you have to know, I assume everyone knows what the tariff schedule is here, right? Everyone's heard of the tariff schedule. So this horn is classified in the tariff schedule under 920890. Now, under the Korea FTA, if either the brass or the rubber is not from Japan or Korea or the United States, you have to satisfy one of these two rules. So either the part, the rubber or the brass, has to come from some other chapter. The first two digits are the chapter, chapter 92. So the raw material comes from another chapter, or it has to come from another heading, but the Japanese value has to be between 35 and 45%. If you're getting a headache now on this product, imagine producing an engine, a wind turbine, some large, complex industrial product for which you would have to apply this rule. Here I've applied it to the horn. So if the manufacturer uses Japanese brass ingot, right, raw brass, and buys rubber from China, that's okay because the rubber is classified under Chapter 40, not 92. So the tariff shift rule is satisfied. This product would qualify for duty-free treatment in the United States as Japanese origin. But let's say the importer still uses brass from Japan, but instead doesn't source the rubber, the raw rubber, but sources this piece, has this manufactured in China. The bulb, I'll call it a bulb. Well, the problem there is that the bulb is classified under a different heading. It's now a part of an instrument. It's not from another chapter, so it fails the tariff shift rule. So the only other option is there enough value in that horn? Does between 35 and 45% of that horn come from Japanese origin product? Now, probably, the brass is probably expensive. But you can see having to do that if this were you can have a bill of material with 20 different inputs on it. You'd have to do that for every single part. So it gets more complicated. Now there's one negotiating item that is hopefully going to make this a lot easier. And that's the concept of cumulation. And this is very important for a regional FTA because it allows, before I was talking only about US and Japanese product as qualifying for the duty preference. The concept of cumulation would allow any TPP country to be considered originating material. So what does that mean? So now let's say the importer uses the Japanese brass, but instead of Chinese rubber bulb, they get it from Vietnam. Vietnam is a TPP member. So now, all of the raw materials come from a TPP country. That means the rule of origin 2 applies. That means you never have to analyze the regional value content. You never have to analyze a tariff shift. It makes it much simpler. Makes it much easier to comply. So cumulation is still being negotiated. And the hope is that it will be included, at least for some products. Some countries may say it's not okay for some things, but the hope is that overall it will be included.
Can I interrupt you again?
Yeah, go ahead.
少し話が専門的になってきたかと思うんでございますが、今お話しいただいているのは実は原産地規則でございます。TPP は当然のことながら多国間交渉ですので、最後に出ましたアキュミュレーション、別にアキュミュレーションと言います、累積の概念、これが使えますと、TPP 加盟国間での付加価値がどんどん積み上げていけますので、要は原産材料を随分、多数の国々から調達することができるというと思います。一方で、それがないもんですから、先ほど例示が出ましたけれども、この資料には書いてなかったんですが、米韓 FTA で韓国企業が非常に苦労しているという話でございました。米韓 FTA で実は原産地規則を満たさない。かといって、メキシコに持っていっても、メキシコで生産したものがまたナフタの原産地規則を満たさない。結局は非原産材料、非原産品としてアメリカに送らざるを得ないので、その結果、残念ながら FTA の効果を取れないんだという実例のようでございますんですけれども、実は FTA を使おうとするために、一部の企業の方々は非常にたくさんの労力をおかけになられて、結果として FTA のメリットを上回るような経費を負担していらっしゃるケースもあるようでございます。何がベストなのかということをよくお考えいただいたらどうかというのが彼の最初だと思うんでございますが、遡りますと、じゃあ本当にこの TPP がいつ出来上がるのかということにつきまして、一番の懸念でありました大統領権限がようやく先週16日に国会に提案されたわけでございます。彼の資料で21日になっておりましたけれども、実は昨日確認しました。私が実際あれ16日じゃないのかと聞きましたら、確かに16日提出された。ただし国会の方でそれを受理するかどうかは決まるのが21日だそうでございます。ということでございます。でこの後は原産地証明の証明法についてお話があるかと思いますので、私が途中で口を挟ませていただくのはこれまでさせていただきたいと思います。どうもありがとうございます。
Thank you. So I want to, let's assume now that there's a TPP agreement and you are the horn manufacturer. You have figured out how to make a horn that's going to comply with TPP so you can sell it duty-free in the US market. What's left is proving to the US authorities that this qualifies. And that's the last thing I want to talk about, because the US model, the US system for validating preference is different than the system in many other countries. So first let's talk about the US model. And they're the same procedures that exist in the US-Korea FTA. Any claim on an entry of merchandise, the import documents, for preferential treatment must include a certificate by the exporter or producer that the good is, in the Korean example, Korean origin, but it would be Japanese origin in the TPP. Or the importer, if the importer knows the production process, can certify on his own, but that is rare. Usually, it is the producer or exporter who signs the certification. Records supporting the claim must be kept for 5 years. Now that means, if you're the horn manufacturer, you have to keep all of your records on where you produced your brass, where you purchased your brass ingot, where you purchased your rubber for the bulb, or where did you buy the bulb. You have to keep all those cost records. You have to keep all those bills of material, because that is the data that proves that you qualify. US Customs can request written information from importers, producers, or exporters, and can even visit you on site if they want to. There are many ports in the United States, and each is their own little kingdom. Port officials have a lot of discretion. They can do, and they can determine how much they want to look into a claim for preference. Typically, you get a request for information that goes to the importer, producer, exporter seeking information to support the claim. The information usually requests confidential cost data, confidential bills of material. And it's often information foreign producers and exporters don't want to provide. There are rules under the US-Korea FTA that allow that information to go directly from the producer or exporter to the US government so that your customer doesn't see any of it, right? To keep the confidentiality. US Customs will issue a notice of action that explains its decision. The importer, though, is ultimately responsible for the duty and can protest that decision within 180 days. That model is very different than much of the world. So much of the world relies on something called the approved exporter model. And under the approved exporter model, goods are certified you receive a certification that your goods exported to an FTA partner qualify. And in this system, the exporter gets the certification from its own government. Right? So the Japanese government would say, you are excellent horn manufacturer, you qualify for duty-free treatment under the TPP. And once that certification is obtained and provided by the exporter to the importer is largely insulated from any claims that the product doesn't qualify. So in this example, I'll use the EU-Korea FTA, which is very different than the US-Korea FTA. The EU-Korea FTA has an approved exporter system. So for a Korean importer to import EU goods under the FTA duty preference, the EU exporter must be approved. And that must be declared on all commercial invoices. To become approved, all the exporter has to do is go to his customs authority, promise to abide by the rules of the FTA, and he becomes approved. It's an honor system. Now, as you might suspect, the US doesn't like this system because they believe governments too readily give that certification. So most people think that the TPP will adopt the US-Korea model, that it's going to be the more rigorous model. But what's interesting is that additional language is going to be added that clarifies what a government can and cannot do in getting information from the foreign producer and exporter. And the reason is interesting. In the US-Korea FTA, the US has begun to complain that Korea is implementing the US model unfairly because Korea questions everything. Korea has been, which is not familiar with the US model, never had the US model before. Korea questions foreign US companies all the time. They want to come and visit the US companies. They want all kinds of information. And if it's not provided, they don't allow US product to enter duty-free. So the US believes part of that is due to a lack of experience, but part of that is also Korea not wanting US product to enter duty-free. So the US wants to clarify what governments can and cannot do, which I think is probably better for everyone. So, this is my last slide. What has to happen between now and TPP getting implemented? The key step will be passage of the TPA, Fast Track Authority in the United States. That has to happen. If that does not pass this year, then the TPP negotiation will probably not be completed until after the US presidential election next year. If TPP passes, and if TPA passes the Congress, and we do get a TPP agreement, it'll still take several years to implement. And that's because every country needs to pass laws to implement these agreements. So even the most favorable time frame is probably 2018. Now, what's important to understand is that everyone does not get implemented at the same time. Every country has its own implementation path. So the US could implement with Vietnam before it implements with Japan. So implementation between the US and Japan will depend on how quickly the Congress passes the legislation, how many changes Japan needs to make to its laws, and then whatever happens politically between now and then. When President Bush negotiated the free trade agreement with Korea, but President Obama opened it up for certain labor negotiations, environmental protections, and auto trade protections. So, things can happen politically that slow things down as well. So, there is a lot of uncertainty, although I think the bottom line is there will be a TPP agreement for those of us who are patient. So, thank you. I hope that was helpful.